Today our guest is Dr. Andrew Snelling.
Layers in the Grand Canyon that are supposed to have millions of years between them, there's no evidence of erosion between them.
Pass it on, share the gospel clear and strong. Stand for, claim your heritage of truth.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today our guest is Dr. Andrew Snelling. Welcome to Heritage of Truth.
Thank you, Jeanne.
But here I'm at the Creation Museum, so it's really your territory.
That's right. Welcome. Glad
Thank
you could make it.
Of all scientific disciplines, geology seems to be the one that people use the most to try and prove evolution. As a research geologist, you see the same evidence that they see, but why do they interpret it differently? Why do you interpret it differently?
Well, I think we have to define our terms. The English language changes, and today what people call evidence is not what it used to be 50 years ago. I like to point out that evidence today is an observation that's been interpreted. And, they say the evidence proves the Bible is wrong. Now, wait a minute, what were your observations and how did you interpret those observations to derive that evidence? So you have to always dig a bit deeper. The point is, all the facts around us we observe in the world today. I mean, a rock doesn't have a label on it saying I'm 200 million years old. You can look at the rock, you can analyse the rock, you can get another sample and repeat your analyses. That's all, observational experimental science, because you can repeat the observations, you can see the crystals in it, the minerals and the colours and all those kinds of things. But as soon as you start to say that rock is 200 million years old, you've got to stop to say, well, how did you do that? Did you do it with radioactive decay or what have you? But then you've got to make assumptions. And so that's why there is this so-called difference of opinion or conflict of worldviews, because it's basically we each have a framework of understanding of the world around us that we use to interpret things. And so as a Christian, I start with God's word as the absolute. And so within that framework, I'm looking at the world. And so when I look at a rock, I'm thinking, okay, does that go back to before the flood, or did it happen during the flood, or did it happen after the flood? Because God gives us an outline of the Earth's history. He doesn't give us all the details, but he does expect to use what he's given us to apply to the world around us. And really the issue with geology that makes it so controversial or causes so much of it to be used so much in this fight over creation evolution is simply because, as a biologist at Harvard University said in the 1950s, time is the hero of the plot. And geology gives the time to the evolutionists. They say, well, you can't see it happening today, but given enough time, it will happen. And if you look at the history of the development of thought, ideas of evolution had been around for many years. But what caused it to take off? Well, Darwin read the book Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell before he wrote his Origin of Species. And Charles Lyell had gained ideas of, the present is the key to the past. Let's extrapolate today's processes back in time. In other words, he chose not to use the Bible as the standard of interpretation of the world, but he chose to use only what we see in the present and extrapolate that backwards. And that idea promoted the millions of years simply because, particle at a time deposition must have taken a long time. If you don't believe that there was a flood, then it would take a long time to accumulate rock layers. If there wasn't a flood, it would take a long time to carve out canyons. And so time is the issue, and it's geology that gives the time, as well as astronomy. But when we're looking at the Earth, it is time. And so that's what gives the evolutionists recourse to promulgate his ideas. He's looking at fossils and he says they're millions of years old, and this creature changed into this creature simply because in this rock we've got this creature, and millions of years later we've got a different creature. And so this whole controversy, certainly geology underpins what what the arguments that people have.
Well, didn't Mount St. Helens show them anything?
Oh yeah, Mount St. Helens was a natural laboratory.
Yeah.
And they do recognise, geologists do recognise catastrophes today. But to put it bluntly, we can use Mars as an example. They went to Mars and they looked at Mars and they see evidence of watery erosion. They have a canyon system there that makes the Grand Canyon look like a gully by comparison. And so they said there must have been a flood of biblical proportions on Mars. Do we find any water there today? No. And yet the Earth is still covered with 70% water, and they tell us there could never be a global flood. So, I mean, that's the problem. They recognise catastrophes. More and more in the geologic record we see evidence of catastrophism. But what they do is they put the millions of years between all those catastrophes, localised catastrophes here, this happened here. More and more we see that many rock layers can be shown to have formed rapidly, but they don't make the next step and say, well, could it have been one event that produced all these layers? Mount St. Helens was a case in point because we actually observed canyons formed rapidly. Within a day, we saw rock layers, multiple rock layers deposited in hours. And so an example like that provides a natural laboratory of what can happen in a catastrophe.
Right. Well, I mean, how can they even think that a tree that goes through several rock layers could have, that those layers had formed over millions of years? That doesn't even make sense.
It doesn't. And the problem is that it's so easy to see an example like that and just ignore it and just sort of pigeonhole it. It's particularly relevant when it comes to, for example, the origin of coal beds. COAL. I have to spell it in case my southern accent people can't understand me. But I can take people to places where you'll have a tree stump sitting on top of a coal bed or coal seam. The tree, and they say the coal formed over millions of years in a swamp with a peat that built up and then got compressed and hardened. And this was a tree, they say, that was growing in the swamp. Well, first of all, it's a type of tree that doesn't grow in swamps. It doesn't have any roots. And it's buried through multiple layers of volcanic ash and actually goes, originally, this tree stump went all the way up through another coal seam. So how could it have survived for millions of years on top of a swamp that it never grew in, got buried, and survived another swamp without rotting? But they got blinkers. They don't want to see that. And yet that example I just gave you is multiplied in many places around the world, in coal beds around the world. I've got lots of examples of that. And so it's so easy to ignore contrary evidence like fossils that take many layers to bury them.
Well, would you tell us about your research regarding the global flood and why you believe that supports the Bible's account?
The point is, I say to people, look, think about it. If the Bible is really true, what does it say? And most people haven't read the details. And when you read the details, it says, all the high hills under the whole of heaven were covered and the mountains were covered. And the ark was floating on a global ocean. And it cleared the highest mountains, pre-flood mountains. So you'd say to us, and we're told that all flesh died. Everything that was on the land surface was wiped out. The only animals that were preserved were those that were on the ark. So you have to ask yourself the question, if that really occurred, what evidence would you look for? I mean, that's a logical question to ask. And Jesus did the same thing. When he was asked a difficult question, he often answered it by asking a question. Should we pay our taxes to Caesar? Well, show me a penny. Whose inscription's on it? Caesar's. Well, pay to Caesar what is Caesar, and what to God is God's. And so we ask ourselves, if the Bible is God's eyewitness account, and it has his stamp of authority on it, then there must be evidence out there that supports it. Well, we'd expect to find evidence, first of all, that the ocean waters cover the continents. And that's a logical inference. You'd expect to find marine creatures buried on the continents, simply because the ocean waters swept up onto the continents to cover the continents. then fish would have been in those waters and other creatures. You expect them to be buried on the continents. You'd expect to find evidence that the rock layers that were deposited by the waters would go right across continents. And so what do we find? First of all, we find evidence that the ocean waters flooded the continents. The interesting thing is the fossils of marine creatures we don't find in the oceans. Around here, underneath the Creation Museum, I can show you corals and clams, and here we are, nearly 1,000 feet above sea level, 500 miles from the ocean. They didn't live here. This is where they're buried. We didn't observe them living here. We didn't observe them dying here. We only observed them buried here, and they're buried up on the continents. You would have expected to find that if the waters were, if rivers running off the continents and floods, etc., were washing creatures downstream, you'd expect to find them buried offshore. But we don't. We find them buried on the continents. In fact, we find marine fossils even on the tops of high mountains today. In other words, these are mountains that were formed as a result of the flood being pushed up at the end of the flood. And then we find rock layers with fossils that go right across continents. One I've just written about, the next issue of Answers magazine, is on chalk. The chalk is an iconic landform on the southern coast of England, but we find it in the Midwest of the US as well. In fact, chalk beds can be traced right across England, right across Europe, all the way down to Egypt, Israel, and Kazakhstan. The same chalk beds with the same fossils we can find from Nebraska to Texas and from Arkansas across to Colorado, and we find the same chalk beds with the same fossils in southern Western Australia. And so here we have a bed which has components of it left all around the world. Now the geologists say, that accumulated slowly, grain by grain. The closest analogue we have today is an ooze on the ocean floor. But there's a problem with that, because they say that the ooze takes, a fraction, 1,000 years for a fraction of an inch. And therefore the White Cliffs of Dover, several hundred feet high, would have taken millions and millions of years to accumulate. Yet if you go to the chalk in Nebraska, the same chalk, you find 14-foot long turtles buried in there. You find fish over 10 feet long with another fish fossilised inside their stomach undigested. How do you fossilise, and you've got dinosaur fossils, you've got bird fossils, how do you fossilise all these together in an ooze on the bottom of the ocean floor? You don't. And it's not, and they're not buried on the ocean floor, they're buried up on the continents. And the purity of the chalk it's so pure, it doesn't compare to the ooze on the ocean floor. So because of their assumption that things are slow and gradual, they're blind to the evidence that these fossils up on the land, a mixture of land and marine fossils buried together, they had to be buried catastrophically, because otherwise you couldn't get those big creatures lying there for thousands and thousands of years without rotting before they were covered. And yet we find this as a fossil, we find this fossil bed of chalk, and it's made up of trillions of microscopic creatures, shells. The chalk is actually a fossil deposit in itself, and we can find remnants of it stretching all around the globe. We can go to the Grand Canyon, and one of the bottom layers in the horizontal layers in the walls of the canyon is a peat sandstone. It sits on top of erosion surface, and underneath you've got granites and other rock like that. We can find the same layer over in Wisconsin sitting on the same erosion surface. You find the same layer of sandstone right across the US, up into Canada, over to Greenland. You can find it all across North Africa, all the way to Israel. In southern Israel, you've got the same sandstone with the same features, the same composition, and sitting on an erosion surface, sitting on a granite. And so this is the sort of evidence that you'd expect to find for the flood. Marine fossils buried on the continent, rock layers that stretch right across the continents, evidence that these rock layers form rapidly, that there were no millions of years between the layers. We find that. Layers in the Grand Canyon that are supposed to have millions of years between them, there's no evidence of erosion between them. If there was millions of years between them, you'd expect to find a topography, but it's not there. And so the evidence is screaming out that there was a catastrophic global flood. but it's only because we've got biblical glasses, because we start with asking the question, if the Bible is true, what evidence will we look for? Then we go and find the evidence. The geologist, the secular geologist says, no, the present is the key to the past. Ignore the testimony of the eyewitnesses that were there. Ignore the Bible. Let's look at what we can see today and extrapolate that backwards. As I say to people, the geologist is like the forensic scientist who wasn't at the crime scene. Okay, they're trying to collect that and they're using assumptions. Now, in a courtroom, is the judge and jury going to listen to the eyewitnesses who saw Joe Brown shoot Mr. Smith, or are they going to listen to the scientists in their laboratory who weren't there and who are trying to piece together and said, no, it was Mrs. Jones, they got it wrong? So, this is the point. If we ask the right questions, we'll get the answers. And if we ask the questions starting from what God's Word says, then we find the evidence is overwhelming.
Yes. Minerals and gems have always fascinated me because there's so much hidden beauty that's just waiting to be discovered. And as you studied the formation of rocks and gems, just tell us a little bit about that research.
Gems have been prized throughout human history and still are today. And there's something that the man in the street can relate to. Diamonds, of course, and emeralds and sapphires and rubies, jade. In fact, I've just written an article for Answers magazine on jade, and I've looked at diamonds. And I mentioned diamonds before. Diamonds form deep inside the earth, and unless they came to the Earth's surface rapidly, what would happen is the changing conditions in a volcanic eruption would cause the diamonds to revert to graphite. They have to get to the Earth's surface very quickly, otherwise the temperature and pressure conditions would change them. And even secularists accept that the diamonds would have come from 100 miles down within 2 hours to the Earth's surface. That's how quickly they would have come in explosive volcanic eruptions. And that's why we have them in pipes, these diamond pipes, because that was the conduit that brought it up. Most eruptions, volcanic eruptions, are explosively initiated by water, steam under pressure. Most of what comes out of a volcano, 70% is water, is steam. In the case of a diamond eruption erupting, we call it a dry eruption because it's fueled by carbon dioxide. So it's like the soda bottle. If you shake it up inside, the cork pops off. Well, that's a bit like the carbon dioxide is under pressure in the mantle. It finds a crack and it goes and explodes at the Earth's surface. And so diamonds have an interesting history. We don't know exactly how they were formed deep inside the Earth. I believe they go back to the time of creation. And they're brought to the Earth explosively. So they speak of catastrophe. Rubies and sapphires are the same mineral, corundum, which is, diamond is the hardest mineral, corundum is the second hardest. Ruby is the red variety, sapphire is the blue variety. And they are found in locations where there has been immense temperatures and pressures. And that's a recurring theme. Jade is formed where you've got temperatures and pressures that relate to earth movements during the flood, catastrophic earth movements. One of the things that was noted even in the 1800s was that if you took North and South America and Europe and Africa, and you could enclose the Atlantic Ocean basin, you could fit them back together again. And one of the first people who noticed that, as a Christian, read in Genesis, the oceans were in one place. He said that God brought the dry land into existence and gathered the waters together into one place. He said, well, if the waters were in one place, the land was in one place.
They talk about Peleg when the earth was, it says when...
Well,
when the earth was divided,
be careful there. If
Okay.
you talk to Hebrew scholars,
what did they say?
they would say that Peleg doesn't necessarily mean a division of the earth. It doesn't even mean a division of the languages. And we're not even sure how his name was derived. The naming formula there is not the same
Okay.
for other people in the
That's
scriptures.
good to know.
But because you see, if some people think that you might have had continental split at the time of Peleg, but the point is, you know now if you get 15 meters of movement in rocks off the coast of Japan, you get a tsunami 50 to 100 feet high that wipes out thousands of people. And so if you get an earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, then freeways collapse in Los Angeles. And so if you're going to cause continental division at the time of Peleg, then you're going to have ginormous earthquakes. They're going to have more destruction than even during the flood. No, that goes back to the flood. And so the original person who noticed that as a Christian thought, well, if the continents were together as a supercontinent before the flood, then you had continental sprint during the flood. And today, there's a lot of good evidence that the Earth's surface is broken up into plates that are moving relative to one another, which is why you get earthquakes. And what we say is these plates move rapidly during the flood. So our original supercontinent broke apart, the fountains of the Great Deep broke open, there was rifting, water came out, molten rock came out, and it moved the plates. And what happened is, therefore, you get India, for example, at the end of the flood, the Indian subcontinent's on a plate. It slammed into Asia, and when it slammed, it produced the Himalayan mountains, the Himalayas. And you think about it, if it was slow and gradual, as the geologists say it is today, centimetres per century, inches per century, the rate, the continental movement today is supposed to be the rate of fingernail growth, whereas during the flood it would have been brisk walking pace. There's a big difference. You think about two cars colliding at 1 mile an hour each. Will they produce much of a ding? No. If they're each doing 100 miles an hour, you'll get a lot of destruction and damage. You'll get a pile up. Even now, we know that where you've got a continent collides with a continent, you're going to produce a mountain range. That's what happened to produce the Himalayan mountains. Where you've got ocean floor plate, ocean material is heavier, it will sink and go down under the continent. Well, where it goes down under the continent, it melts, produces volcanoes. We've got the Andes Mountains as a result. You'll also melt some of the ocean, the lower part of the Earth's crust, and you'll produce granites. All the Sierra Nevada are due to the Pacific plate going underneath the western margin of the United States and North America, and it melting down there has produced all the magma that's come up and produced the granites all through the Sierra Nevadas, the beautiful ones you see in Yosemite National Park. Well, in these collision zones, it's actually where we have the temperatures and pressures that will produce these gemstones. And so, for example, slivers of ocean floor that are rich in olivine will have the chemistry right with the fluids to produce jade, or you'll produce emeralds, or you'll produce rubies and sapphires. And so the interesting thing is, out of a calamity called God's judgment of the flood, there are actually things of beauty produced. And I often remind people that is an important picture of God, that even in judgment, God is merciful. God judged Jesus Christ on the cross, and because he shed his blood as the eternal creator, his sacrifice could be infinite for all people in all places through all time. And I like to remind people that if Jesus wasn't the creator, then how could he die for everyone? Because he was infinite, his sacrifice could be infinite. And even in that horrific moment, God was providing a merciful way of relief. The ark that we're building is a symbol of God's mercy and grace in the midst of judgment. Well, you think about it. All the plant material that got swept away as God's judgment on the pre-flood world got buried in layers that produce coal and oil that we can use today. So even in judgment, God was merciful in providing resources that we'd need in the post-flood world, in the world today. And it's a beautiful picture of God's judgment, but mercy at the same time. And gems are very similar. These gems, which are so exquisitely beautiful, There was a sapphire that was just found recently I think it's valued at millions and millions of dollars. It's huge. It's perfectly blue star sapphire. It's the largest one that's known, just been found recently. And the second largest diamond was just found recently, and it's just been valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. But these are things of exquisite beauty that we place a high value on, but they come out of the pressure and temperatures and the catastrophe of the flood. And I think that tells a message to people, which is why I've been interested in gems, because people can relate to those things.
It's kind of like when we have pressure in our lives and then God uses it to
Well, that's
make
the
us
thing
more
in
like
this
Him.
article on jade, because of the pressures and stresses. Paul says in Corinthians, we're pressed on every side, and yet God is working in us as a result of those pressures to refine us.
Right.
And so that's a picture of what happened during the flood in producing these gems, and He does it in our lives as well by putting us under stress, so that we trust Him more,
Right.
and His faithfulness in everything.
Share